With the Philadelphia 76ers offseason now in full swing, Daryl Morey stepped to center stage and spoke to the media for the first time. He tipped his hands at a little bit of what the expectations for this offseason, what the goals are, and what type of players may just be brought into this team. So I want to dive into a couple of different notable quotes, what we know and what Daryl Morey did reveal. As I like to mention with Daryl is I do respect the way he does take things head on, answers questions in a more candid way than most general managers or is the case with, that he is one of the more forward-facing and public figures of any front office personnel that I can remember. So let's dive into a couple notable quotes. And the first one here, he was asked about what is the ideal player that you do want to pair with Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. And Daryl's reply is, quote, a wing who can play at a high level in the playoffs. Now, of course, this is coming directly from Daryl's mouth already. We did get further confirmation of it from Shams Charania of The Athletic later in the day, who said the Sixers are planning to go, quote, big game hunting this offseason with the hopes of adding, quote, one more star player around Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. He continues to say they're going to be rumored with every top free agent, every top player that's on the trade market. They want to see how they can add one more star player around Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. That obviously puts the future of Tobias Harris in question. Now, to address the Tobias Harris situation first, there was one quote that did scare me from Daryl Morey here, who was asked by, shout out to Sam DiGiovanni of Clutch Points here. He says, ask Daryl Morey about Tobias Harris and if there's a chance he could re-sign with the Sixers. Morey said Harris, quote, for sure can be a contributing player on a contender, and reiterates a previous response that they have interest in all of their free agents. Now, for starters, I have zero interest in Tobias Harris being back on this Sixers team. That we just watched him score 0 points in an elimination game in Game 6. We know that he has not lived up to the standards of the contract since the second the ink dried on it. That for years it has been quite clear that you're kind of jamming a square peg into a round hole to make him fit on the Sixers team, and it is best for both sides to move on. Now, with that all being said, I do think this was a little bit of Daryl Morey doing him a favor, that for all the bad things that I can say about Tobias from the pure basketball standpoint, I think Daryl's just looking out on the human being and good guy standpoint, that there can be no critiques about the professionalism of Tobias Harris, and especially when we lived through the eras of Ben Simmons and James Harden, that I do have respect for the way that Tobias handled himself on a night in, night out standpoint, and I do think that was a little bit of Daryl Morey just doing him a favor in the public eye. Now, to get back to the original point here about it being a wing player, this is something that I did think was interesting. That some of my takeaways from the press conference as a whole is it is clear that Daryl Morey wants to go for a third star, that is plan A. Now, he also confirmed that that's not necessarily going to happen, that they want to keep all options open, with that having to do with the draft, with that having to do with the cap space, the flexibility, all these things, that they also can buy into a mindset or a plan of getting the best quality role players to surround these two. But it was pretty clear, reading between the lines and seeing the quotes that he spit out, that plan A would be it to bring in this third star. Now, there were a couple other points I wanted to hit on here. Number one, when speaking about the draft specifically, I did think this was interesting from Daryl Morey's perspective, and to get the exact quote here, he said, quote, I do really love pick 16. The storylines have been that the draft is worse. I don't see that at all, actually. I'm very excited about who's at 16. As you might expect, we have all options open on the table. Trade, into the future, so we have more picks available for future trades. If we do pick, I'm excited about who's there. I kind of had approached this offseason with it basically a conclusion in my mind that 16 pick would be traded, and frankly, that's very much still on the table. But I was surprised to see Daryl so complimentary of the potential options, and frankly, I would agree with him that as an NBA draft guy myself, I'm already starting to get into the weeds and find the guys that I'm starting to fall in love with. Jared McCain at the 16 pick, I would be very happy with for the Sixers perspective, but we'll dive deeper into that as it gets closer. But Daryl does not strike me as the draft guy, that I think he would much rather be big fish hunting, to be a guy trying to wheel in these big names rather than take a guy, especially when considering the window to win being currently right now, that I do expect Daryl to be working the margins with this. But he also had a couple interesting thoughts on the young core as a whole, and I do think this is notable here. So these quotes that he said, quote, I do like having a good core of young players, but I feel like we're developing that with Paul and Ricky Council IV, but we're mostly going to be a veteran-led team. And he continues on to say that there's going to be a lot of changes except for Nick Nurse, Joel, Tyrese, Paul, and Ricky, who are the only players under contract for next season. We don't know for sure who's going to be back next year. Now, what I think is most specifically interesting here is the comment regarding Paul Reed. So we knew the situation with Paul Reed dating back to last offseason, that he was a restricted free agent, that the Utah Jazz went out of their way to try and sign Paul Reed to pry him away from this franchise, and had a couple unique clauses that they put in the contract, one of them being that the contract for the next 2 years only becomes fully guaranteed if the Sixers or the Jazz at this point make it past the first round. Now, obviously, we can see that did not happen for the Sixers here. So Paul Reed's contract currently non-guaranteed. It was kind of on my mind, and I think I was more leaning towards expecting it to happen, that Daryl Morey would not guarantee those years to try and search for a new backup center. And I am a Paul Reed guy, big fan of his game, big fan of the dude, the person, the brand, the out the mud, all that stuff. But I can't lie and say I wasn't underwhelmed by his performance as a whole this year. And he did have some hot stretches. I do think as the year went on, he got better. But he did not take that step forward in his game that I think a lot of us were hoping. That I don't really see the future vision of Paul being a guy capable of playing next to Joel Embiid. And especially based on the fact that Nick Nurse coming into the season was very upfront about his desire to try new things, to absolutely have him share the floor with Joel. And then after a whole season, for those not to occur, I do think that says something about Paul Reed, or at least says something about the lack of trust that Nick Nurse has in him. And now this is two coaches that is the situation, because we saw it with Doc Rivers and Nick Nurse, who is a guy who tends to be more trusting with kind of the archetype of player of Paul Reed. When you think back to the Pascal Siakams and Chris Bouchers of the world, who Nick Nurse was so effective with up in Toronto, the fact that it did not happen is a little discouraging to me, and kind of why I was expecting him to end up in the free agent market once again. But as he mentioned with this quote saying that, I do like having a good core of young players. I feel like we're developing that with Paul and Ricky Council IV. I did think was interesting there. And there were a couple other players that he was asked about specifically and mentioned. Number one, Kelly Oubre Jr., who I knew was a fan favorite amongst all of us and a guy that I'm certainly hoping to have back in a Sixers uniform. Morey went and speak about what a breath of fresh air that he was for the franchise, just how hard he competed, and talked about how he is absolutely a guy that they want to bring back. And Morey was pretty open, saying, like, we want all of our free agents back, but the bottom line is that's not the reality of the NBA. And honestly, the bottom line here is that should not be the case, because it did not get the job done with all those guys here, so you got to shake it up a little bit. And probably one of the bigger mysteries approaching this offseason is Buddy Hield. That we know that was the prized deadline acquisition, is this guy who can, strike the fear of God into opponents' hearts, as Daryl Morey said after that he did trade from. And he had an interesting quote about Buddy. Again, this a testament to Morey being a little bit more upfront and just cutting the nonsense than most general managers. And what he said was, quote, "I think at no fault to Buddy, I think the fit was less good than I thought. Most of the time was without Joel, but I thought when Joel was back that his impact and his shooting, that he'd get more open shots, and he didn't. That's on me that it didn't work out as well as I hoped. I still think that it was one of the better acquisitions. I was really happy he showed what he could do in Game 6. There was no one more disappointed than him that he fell out of the rotation. I think that Nick Nurse correctly saw, based on how they were guarding us, that it was hard for him to impact the game. I think Kyle Lowry and Cam Payne both really added to the team, so they were able to add at a high level. Buddy didn't quite work out as well as we hoped, but I do think going forward, it still could work depending on the other players that are around Joel and Tyrese." So Buddy himself spoke following the elimination that Philly would be his priority as far as, expectations, that he is a free agent looking for a new home. And it was cool to see him recognize that, saw that, that there is a belief in him from Philadelphia due to the fact that they went out and traded for him. I'll just be upfront and say that I would like Buddy Hield back on this team, and he does firmly fall in the category of like cost dependent. Like he's definitely, I have a high margin for being priced out of him, that if there's a hefty offer on the table for another team, you got to let him walk. But I would like to see, can he be further unlocked if there's a whole season, if there's more of a familiarity for playing next to Joel Embiid, or if they bring in these other stars with Tyrese Maxey, with potentially Paul George or Jimmy Butler or whoever that may be. Could Buddy Hield be an effective player on this team? I still think the answer to that could be yes, which is why I want to see him around. And at the worst, I think he's a guy who could be traded in the future. That if you sign him to, say, a 3-year, $40 million contract, or 3-year, $45 million contract, which in my eyes is likely the ballpark of where he goes, you can still move that deal down the line. And frankly, that might end up being a plus value contract at this point in time. I do think that he's not going to be as bad as he looked for a period of time. Really, it wasn't even him playing poorly. It was just the lack of shots that he was getting off, which obviously is the reason that you brought him in the first place. So there's no doubts that Buddy Hield underwhelmed during his time in Philadelphia thus far. But I think just like Game 6, where he came alive knocking down 5 3-pointers, that caliber of shooter is somebody you want playing next to Joel Embiid, and I'm willing to roll the dice and expect it to get better. So overall, there's still a lot more questions than answers for this offseason. What we do know is Daryl Morey is about to get busy. That this is the first offseason where Daryl Morey is not undoing past wrongs to build this team. That there's no Al Horford contract to trade. There's no Ben Simmons contract or holdout to get off. There's no, Tobias Harris contract still logging down the books. Right now, the canvas is completely blank, and it's up to Daryl Morey to paint it as he sees fit. This season specifically, this offseason right here, is what Daryl Morey can truly be judged on. And the jury is still out on whether this will be a success or not, but I do think a lot of past critiques or past issues this franchise have been things that Daryl Morey has inherited. So now it is his time to build a proper actual championship contender in a way that has not quite been the case yet. I'm optimistic due to those factors, that there is this ability, this flexibility, all these options that they have that simply have not been the case in years past, but now we need to see it in action. So I'll be here every step of the way, breaking things down right here on Sixers Digest. Appreciate each and every one of you tuning into this video. Make sure you're smashing that subscribe button to keep the Digest family growing. Grab a couple comments. Let me know your predictions for the offseason as a whole. And make sure that you're hitting that like button to let me know you're listening. Appreciate you guys once again. Talk next time. Peace.